Good day and welcome, everyone. This is Paul Rocchio at the International Franchise Association. I want to thank you for joining us for another IFA Coronavirus Updates webinar. We have an excellent topic for you and an awesome presenter as well. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping matters. Moving forward, we're going to be kind of refocusing the IFA Coronavirus Updates webinars. They will now be the Roadmap to Recovery webinars. So we're all looking towards more positive things down the road. We are recording today's webinar and we will make it available on the IFA's community.franchise.org microsite, along with a transcript of today's webinar as well, and that'll be up sometime early this evening. So on that note, I would like to turn things over to my good friend Daryl Johnson from FranData. Daryl has been a valued member of IFA, past chair of IFA's Supplier Forum Advisory Board, sits on IFA's Finance Committee, and aside from me always joking around with him all the time, I consider him a good friend. And look at that picture of you, Daryl. I love that. I should have known you were going to put up a picture covering your face with a mask. So on that note, thanks for the chuckle. I needed that, buddy. On that note, I'm going to turn things over to this masked man, Daryl Johnson. Daryl, please take it away.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, IFA. I do appreciate the opportunity to talk to the franchise community today. I would like to start with a great appreciation for the medical community through all of this. And if any of you have family that is involved in the medical profession, when we sign up for the military, people know that they may be put in harm's way. A few people sign up in the medical profession with anything other than intent to help save lives. And yet they're in harm's way today. And I think what we all have a great debt of gratitude for all of the people that are on the front lines and throughout this crisis. Let me turn to where we are. I want to split this into two basic presentation topics. One is what we know, and the other is what we think based upon what we know. And I want to make a clean separation for those two, but let's start with what we know. There's a great deal of information out there. There's a lot of confusing information, and yet in the franchise community, we have to plan. We have to anticipate these things. We can't turn around a business overnight. So understanding what's really going on and what it means is the foundation with which hopefully we can move forward. So I want to spend 10 or 15 minutes looking at what we know and trying to bring it down to some common characteristics that may be informative in terms of what we think this all means and where we think this is going. If we can translate what we know into some business actions, we can actually get through this, but we have to be smart about what we're looking at. The key here is ultimately, I think, confidence. When consumers go back to work, when consumers go to the store, when consumers start gathering, when schools start up, when we get our lives back in order, when all of this is happening without the risk of a further crisis, which would be devastating, that's what we're all trying to understand. So it really comes down to a level of confidence. When do individuals, when do consumers have confidence? We are hearing state, federal, local governments making decisions now about when they're reopening. Government may influence what consumers think, but not very much, certainly not in this kind of environment. I think we can ignore the noise of protests, what Georgia just did in reopening. The data is showing that people stopped socializing before governors and mayors started recommending it. And the same is going to be true on the recovery. People are more worried about lifting restrictions right now, according to survey data, lifting restrictions too soon rather than keeping them in place too long. And it's the consumer and household behavior that's going to drive when things restart. The other thing we know is this is not a pattern that we have seen in similar recessions in the past, where recovery may start rather slowly, but it's somewhat evenly distributed. This isn't going to be distributed by industry. It's not going to be distributed even by region. It's going to be distributed very, very locally. And we'll get into some of the reasons for that. Obviously, it's unprecedented what we're encountering. They're estimating that we're going to see a worldwide shrinkage of about 3% this year. U.S. will be somewhere in the neighborhood of double that. That's the current estimates. Over 26 million job losses in just 5 weeks. That kind of vacuum that has been sucked out of the economy is just unprecedented. And on the other side of that, the financial stability of households, we have a substantial number of American households that just simply aren't prepared to deal with a very long or extended period of economic suppression, such as what we're getting, which is why the government had such a huge response. And that response led to a tremendous amount of money that's come into the economy, or is attempting to, at least, by the government, and that will continue. I don't think we're anywhere close to where that's going to end. So what do we know? We know the recovery is going to be very uneven. The unevenness of it is something that will factor into how do we react to it, and I'll get into that in a few minutes, but it really is very, very localized. If we look at what happened in past pandemics, and there's been many of them, there just hasn't been a very bad one for a number of decades, almost 100 years ago, but the one that was anywhere close to this, the Spanish flu of 1918, it lasted about 2 years. It, at that time, infected ultimately about 1/3 of the world's population, which at the time infected about 500 million people, and had somewhere between 20 and 50 million people that died from it. Well, that's a magnitude huge different than what we're seeing today, but there are lessons to be learned from that. Most of these pandemics that we've seen, the cycle of pattern of behavior that from the beginning to the end of it has been about 1.5 to 2 years. Well, we knew, at least early reporting as early as the end of December, where there were some signals given that the coronavirus was on the expansion path. So if you use that as a time frame, what we're really looking at, given that we're also hearing that vaccines are coming into the mix at a pace that is likely not to be impactful for at least until the end of this year and maybe early next year, what we're really implying from all of this, it seems, is that we're only about 1/3 of the way through the overall crisis. If you can add that to what I just discussed on it's really consumer mindset that is going to drive this, that time frame, I think, gives us a better sense of where our recovery path is likely to unfold over coming months. Yes, it'll start to pick up again, but it's going to be a long way from when the household psychology is going to allow that to take place in a comfortable way. The economy is interconnected, which is to say that Georgia, which has just reopened for business, is going to be, the businesses in Georgia are going to be dependent on getting supplies from Ohio and Kansas and other places. So the reactivation of the whole business community is going to be very sporadic and very inconsistent. And I will touch on that as it relates to franchising in a few minutes. Households, I'm sorry, let me, restarting the economy, whether it's in Georgia, whether it's in any part of the country, is going to be very, very location specific. And I say that to the franchisors listening today, because if you have a system of 100 or 200 or 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 units, looking at how the system restart is going to take place is a very macro view that isn't going to work here. It's very localized in how this is going to unfold. One county's activity and mindset and social behavior is going to be very different than the county right next door, and we need to understand it at that level in order to reactivate all of the franchise systems in a close to successful way. Clearly, the government recognizes that they've got a huge problem, and we've seen both Congress and the Fed react. When the Fed dropped interest rates as dramatically as they did, it caught the entire market by surprise, but they knew it was coming, and we are, I think, a ways away from having any end to the government payment programs, the second of which just launched today, and I'll touch on that in a minute. The White House has laid out a three-phase plan. The first part is businesses starting up again. There's not a time frame that's specific to this, but in the next few months, where some of the social distancing and telecommuting is being emphasized, but it's going to be a federal encouragement for business to get back and started. However, phase two of that is going to start the gyms, the schools, the places where people gather. And if that's the phase two, it's going to make it very hard to get phase underway, because 1/3 of the households in the U.S. have children less than 14 years of age. How are parents going to get into that flow and into that? There's only a limited amount of telecommuting that can be done for businesses, and most of the franchise community really needs that consumer interaction. So what that's saying is that time frame is not going to be as early as the summer for a fair number of industries. And the risk is restarting too soon. Restarting too soon is not only going to be costly for a franchisee, but it's also going to be potentially impactful to the brand, either with too little activity, or if there's any risk of a recovery challenge from the coronavirus. It's going to have a substantial negative impact in that local community and any businesses there that have been associated with it, as we see the media quickly jumping on. If we look at just the framework of where businesses are in the U.S., this was a recent survey done by MetLife and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and here their message was pretty clear. Over half of small businesses, which is a huge number, well over 20 million, over half of these businesses are expected to be closed as of today. The survey was done just a couple of weeks ago, and the date was picked was today for where businesses are likely to be at that point. And at that point, just a few weeks ago, these businesses, 43% of them said that they had less than 6 months before they can get their business back to at least close to profitable in order to avoid shutdown. Very dramatic. We know that in franchising because we're disproportionately being impacted in many ways. Impact on small business revenue, over 85% of small businesses from the survey that was just done at the beginning of April, over 85% of them have said that they've had at least a 25% loss of revenue. And this was at the beginning of it. If you look at industries, and the reason I'm highlighting industries on the other side, several of the industries that are in here, construction, professional services, those were industries, and the bar chart on the right side is showing the probability of closing by industry, and if at 1 month, 4 months, and 6 months. And two of the industries here, construction and professional services, were on the kind of the middle range of industries that were being impacted or thought they would be impacted by the risk of closing. And yet, those are two of the top 3 industries that were able to get access to the PPP money in the first round. Given that that's where the concentration was, almost 40% of it went to those 3, construction, professional, and manufacturing. Where it didn't go to what's franchising? As the IFA survey that was done in the last 2 weeks showed, a substantial number of franchisees did not participate in the first round. The second round opened up 3 hours ago, and the expectation is it's going to go fairly quickly. With all of that, the question is then, what does this all mean? If that's kind of the foundation of it, if we know that many small businesses are directly impacted, if we know that the timeline from a historical perspective of medical crises of this sort typically run 12 to 18 months, and we look at where we are today, what does that imply in the way of what franchising should be doing? The first thing I think that is the most, perhaps the most important message in this is to think very locally. And it's one of the slogans that we've used in franchising for some time is to think locally. But here we have to really concentrate on what is going on in a particular area right around a unit. Because if we don't, we're going to be giving either too soon or too late of signals to franchisees in those markets. We do know that unit costs are going to change a lot. Rent, very likely in many locations, is going to go down, and that's going to soften things. But we also know the cost of doing business is going to rise. Is that going to be a trade-off? Well, we know that the expense structure of many franchised units, and what we're hearing from franchisors as they're looking at evaluating the restarting plans of their franchisees, that there's a lot of shifting of expenses. On a net basis, it's not exactly clear whether that means that we're going to be operating more efficiently, but it certainly means over time we're going to change some of the models that we're using for it. The decisions that need to be made at the franchisor level really do get down to a very specific location. And essentially that message has got to start with whether that unit was even healthy before this crisis hit. Because from a financial standpoint, if we have operating units in locations that were marginal before the crisis, the real question is, should they be around? And that's the cold, hard reality of what capitalism is confronted with in a crisis like this. When you have a dramatic recessionary impact on an economy, they're going to be losers and they're going to be winners out of it. But first we have to deal with decisions around whether businesses should come back. And yes, this is impacting people's investments, people's livelihoods. But the first step is really understanding what the dynamics are for that unit in that location. And the start of that is understanding where the health is of that unit before the crisis hit. Whether the economic factors coming out of this crisis on the labor costs, whether they're going to be lower or even higher to draw people out of the unemployment insurance or the unemployment benefits arena. Those are very localized decisions that need to take place. To restart the brand, though, that assessment needs to really be done at a local level. And the problem that we're confronted with is that at the local level, it's really hard to understand what the mindset is of household and consumer behavior. We can get to that, I think, because we now are seeing some information that's actually coming out that will be helpful. Before I get to that, let me just mention one other thing, which is on the banking side. We're in day one of the second round of PPP. It's underway. Virtually every application that is going to get approved has already been teed up and is sitting in the queue with whatever financial institution is going to push that into the SBA E-Trans system. That money is going to go very quickly. Congress knows, IFA is working on a lobbying side, and they know that there's got to be more, and there very likely will be more. And it's to that point that I would highlight that, for a franchisee, whether the fintech option, which is now coming into play, is helpful or not, I would certainly advise franchisees, if they don't have a relationship with an SBA lender, to try and find one and build one, because there will be, in all likelihood, more rounds, even if the second round is exhausted fairly quickly. And towards that end, there are several different tools that are available on the SBA website itself. There is a find a lender, an SBA lender for local areas. And if I'm a franchisor, I would certainly want to try and help franchisees do that, because the subsequent rounds, it will be helpful to be connected to them. The FranData website, and I don't mean this to be self-serving, but there is a very helpful tool that for franchise registry members that franchisors can access that shows not only local SBA lenders, but only SBA lenders that have actually been active in franchising. So at least they've made a commitment to understanding the franchise business model. I think in this environment, that can be very helpful. So those are two sources for guidance on the lending side. What we also think from all of this is that the government won't dictate the recovery, and I think it would be a mistake to rely on the signals that are coming from, whether it's local, state, or even national opening of areas of the country. As I mentioned at the beginning, consumers are not reacting as much to what the government is saying as they're reacting to what their own local environment is telling them. That social mobility is a key to it, and understanding social mobility in the context of how to restart if your system is, or units are closed down, or how to anticipate a return to a more normal revenue stream for those that have been operating continuously, is built more on what social mobility activity is doing than what the government is saying. And I say that because there's a lot of virus data out there. You can be quite overwhelmed with it. We've looked at a lot of it. It's good. It gives a pretty good indicator of not only where, at the county level at least, where the curve is starting to bend, or whether it's still in an upward trajectory on covered cases or confirmed cases. But it also gives some indication of what's likely to be happening 2 to 3 weeks out in the social mindset around that county. However, that's only one of the two key factors. It often informs that result, the confirmed case movement, is what the social behavior is. And understanding how social behavior is unfolding at a local level is perhaps at the core of understanding what is likely to happen in the way of a return to business for those franchisees on a very location-specific basis. The consumer psychology is what I think is ultimately driving this, and what we've at FranData have studied and have talked to a number of franchisors about is, how do you overlay the confirmed case activity with any kind of social behavior, social mobility patterns? And what we think we can do, and I think what I would encourage franchisors to investigate further, is to be able to overlay where that unit is with what is happening in the trend in that county, with what in confirmed cases, what is happening, and how social behavior is and social mobility is taking place at a county level. And if you can do those things, you should be able to gain a roadmap for, on a unit by unit basis, how this pattern of recovery is likely to unfold, even though this early prediction of it maybe by May or June and things will start to normalize might be premature. We should see at least a rise in it, and having that ability to look 30 to 60 days out and finding ways of doing that, I would highly recommend that you try and do. If I were to summarize all of this, I would say that we're talking to franchisors every day, and we're hearing from them that there's a lot of change that they're instituting within their systems. They're already anticipating the recovery. They're already making decisions that are leading to, at least on a differential basis, how different parts of their system can get restarted. And a lot of innovative things are happening. One of the great strengths of the franchise business model, notwithstanding its view as being constrained by franchise agreements and by regulatory rules, is it's very adaptable. And that adaptability is where the strength of franchising is going to ultimately lead to a stronger return to business for many franchisors. To be clear, we're going to lose franchised units. We're going to lose franchisees. And in some cases, we're going to lose franchisors. That's what's happening now. And that's capitalism. That's the way it unfolds in a situation like this. But what we are also seeing is that the adaptability of many brands, some of them mature and very large, are making changes in their products and services now in anticipation of how that's going to evolve coming out of this. It may change if they're retail, their footprint size. It may change how they create that interaction with the customer. But those are all plans that are in place now. And the final point that I would make before we turn to questions is that one of the things we learned from the last financial crisis is that the pattern of new unit development, which is what franchising is built upon, will start slowly. There will be a fair amount of consolidation of units that were perhaps underperforming going into the downturn, but have locations and positions where the stronger operators may find them to be a better alternative than to adding units. So we will see another round of multi-unit acquisition of other franchised units. We will see a contraction in the number of system size from many franchise systems. But if history is any indication of what that implies for the next round, we should see that move fairly quickly through this once we get to the tail end of the psychological concern about the coronavirus. And that may not be until the fall or winter of this year as we start to see the recovery take a more significant upturn. With that, Paul, I will turn it back to you and to questions.
Well, Daryl, wonderful, and thank you. Very insightful, as I would have expected. So I'm sure everyone else who's participating today feels the same. And of course, we do have a number of questions. So I will jump right in here. First question from Susan. When do we predict the new unit development will start?
If
somewhat
the information
but...
that well, if the information that I went through and the analysis that Frandata has done, both in support of what the IFA has been doing and in our own research and interaction with franchisors is any indication, it looks like we are in the broader answer to that is that it looks like it's 6 to 12 months out. There are franchisors that are actually adding units now that are still conducting business, and this isn't a blanket statement that every franchisor will follow this pattern. As we know, franchising is cut across 220 or 230 sectors of the U.S. economy, and some of them are doing just fine in this downturn. In fact, some of them are even thriving in it. But the broad statement of when is franchising going to see new development activity kick up in a significant way is that it looks like to us that it's going to not be before the fall, because we've got to get through a period where the consumer mindset is, I feel comfortable going out again. I feel comfortable engaging and spending money again. We have taken 26 million jobs out of the economy in the last 5 weeks. That's a huge downdraft of spendable income that has just been sucked out of the economy. Those things need to be digested. What franchising typically benefits from is economic downturns, because it usually creates a whole new generation of potential franchisees. But in this case, we've got to see the psychology of the consumer turn around first before we start seeing a willingness in a significant way for prospects to look at seriously at business alternatives.
Excellent. Thank you. Next question, and I'm taking this out of context because it was earlier on in your presentation. I should have jotted down a note, but this person is asking, where are you getting the data that we are 1/3 of the way through? I think this was when you were referring to 1/3 of the way through. I believe the pandemic, I think.
Well, the answer to this is that there's no one that's out there that's saying, here's the timeline from when it started to when it'll end, and this is where we are on the graph. What we have done, the Fran Data research team has looked at several different aspects of what the pattern has been during pandemics of this sort. As I mentioned at the time with the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919, other pandemics since then, the pattern from beginning to end, which weren't as dramatic, SARS was just a decade ago. The pattern from when it started to when it started to become a non-issue spanned 18 to 24 months. And while we have much better intelligence and tracking ability today than we've ever had before, we don't have cures. We don't have good measurement systems to even test. And those two constraints are the constraints that lead us to conclude that if we look at this pattern that we're in right now, compared to what has happened in past medical comparisons that are I think fair comparisons to what we're dealing with right now, that pattern has really been an 18 to 24 month pattern. And if you overlay what we're hearing from CDC, what we're hearing from the administration on the potential vaccines, the potential ways of treating and minimizing and even testing, that flow pattern suggests that we're not really through this until we go through another cycle this fall. Once we get this one down for the summer, this next cycle in the fall is likely to be an issue until it starts to coincide with better detection and better and some vaccines that have the potential to treat it. That typically is about 18 to 24 month span. So the reason we said that is 18 to 24 months is really built on that. I'd rather be wrong on that, because if we're wrong, we're probably wrong on it being less time rather than more time. But I think for business planning purposes, we have to be realistic about how this is going to be socialized into consumer mobility. And if we look at it from that perspective, the chances are we're really looking at about an 18 to 24 month cycle. We're going to see a business pickup, hopefully, in the next month or two. But that's far different than saying we're going to see this kind of work its way through, and it's not going to be in people's daily conversations.
Excellent. Thank you, Daryl. Next question. I have received the EIDL grant and the rest of the EIDL loan is in process. Am I eligible to use the employee retention tax credit along with EIDL.
I would like to do this. Whoever asked that question, would you
Yeah, I'll
send,
you want me to send
Paul an email? Yeah, just send you an email, and we'll get the answer to that. But off the top of my head, I'm not sure of the answer to that, and let's make sure we get it. And Paul, I can help you do that.
Yeah.
But I don't have a definitive answer, so I'd rather make sure that we get the right answer for that question.
Yep, I'm sending Sonny my email right now, so thank you for that. Next question. With the second round of PPP for businesses, will there be a second round or an additional stimulus for the non-essential workers still home until further notice? Any thoughts on that?
I'm not quite sure of the question. There is. Let me see if I can address it this way. The second round of PPP started at 10:30 this morning.
Yeah. Yep.
Yes, and it will run for, in likelihood, it'll run out of money quickly. One thing I would note on that is one of the reasons I was emphasizing for franchisors to encourage their franchisees or help their franchisees get an SBA lending connection is that during this the round that just started today, while it was $300 billion, sounds like a lot of money to be putting out there. The majority of that, big banks, fintech, they're teed up to just crush the SBA approval process with applications. But there was a set aside of $60 billion for smaller lending institutions and credit unions. And most of franchise lending goes through those smaller institutions. So that set aside is a bit of a filter that may allow more access for franchising through that local SBA connection, which is why I was emphasizing it earlier, and I should have mentioned that at the time. It's an important set aside. This other money is likely to go out very quickly. And so I would encourage franchisors to help their franchisees find SBA connections if they don't already have them. And there's certainly some helpful tools that are out there to do that. Now, with regard to the other part of this question, Paul, I'm not sure I understood it. Were you able to?
If I'm understanding it correctly, I think they're wondering if additional stimulus for non-essential workers still home. I guess like the $1,200 checks basically that were sent out to folks like you and me. If additional money will be sent out to John and Jane Q Public, I guess, is the way I understand that question. The second part of the question.
Mm-hmm.
And I would defer to your. I've not heard anything myself about that, but
no, I haven't heard any further individual stimulus checks discussion. But I would defer to your GR team, and perhaps through them you could have a response back on that, Paul, because your GR team is on top of everything that's being talked about behind the scenes in Congress right now, and so I would encourage you to just get their input on it to be able to respond to that question. If the question, though, was aimed at, is there any more of the kind of the payroll-based stimulus for yet another round, I think there will be some form of another round, because if the second round goes very quickly, it's a clear signal to Congress that we're not anywhere close to stabilization yet of these businesses. And we know that. We know that's the case. So the likelihood is there will be incremental rounds of some sort coming out of Congress. And what each one of these rounds, the second one was different than the first one in some material respects. The next one will be different than the last one. But I do think we can anticipate more.
And actually, looking at the second part of that question, I think you just answered it. My mistake. I did not read that off properly, but I think you just covered it. So thank you, Daryl. Next question. Can you go into more detail about what the risks are of opening too early, such as running out of cash, being the source of an outbreak and bad press, or something else? Question mark.
Well,
The great
really,
unknown, of course.
yeah, I would put it into two risks. I would put it in the risk of cash is king right now. Cash reserves are golden, and doing anything too soon is going to spend money unnecessarily because it was too early to do that. And typically, the startup, and I'll use retail as an example, but it applies to any franchise. The startup involves hiring people, and it involves bringing product into the establishment. That takes money, and if it's too early, there's unnecessary money going out the door, and it's not generating business. There's a secondary implication there that if you're bringing it in, employees in too soon, you not only have the risk of spending money and having the potential for the community going into a second round of outbreak hysteria, but you're also having to deal with employees who you encourage to come back in and then didn't have much activity, and yet another round of outbreak hits that locality. And I've mentioned 3 or 4 times in this discussion today, everything is local here. We've got to get that mindset that you simply can't make a blanket decision about the system as a whole, or even about a state. You've got to make a decision based on as narrow a locality as you can get, because it's that mindset in that local community that's going to dictate about how things are unfolding. Doing it too soon is a cash flow issue, but it's also an employee issue, an employee morale issue. It's also you're marketing it locally to rebuild business, and you're out in front of where others are. You want to be right on that cusp because you want to hire employees that are the best that you can get out there. You want to be out there with marketing ahead of what your competitors are doing. You just don't want to be too far ahead, and that's where that 30 to 60 day window, the better visibility you have into what's going on in that local community in that 30 to 60 day window, the better chance are that you'll time it in a way that actually leads to a better outcome.
Excellent. Can you share examples of franchise systems that are innovating? I guess innovating at this, during the pandemic, I would imagine.
Well, I can share some examples of things, some immediate actions that franchisors took. The faster ones on stopping contributions to the marketing fund, of waiving royalties for a period of time, of dropping certain requirements of franchisees that they would otherwise have that would cost money. Those are things that were done fairly early on. What we're starting to see now, though, is a rethinking of the offering and the configuration within, if it's a retail, and I keep deferring to retail because it's the one that I think we can visualize the most easily, but this applies to a lot of different businesses. It's rethinking if we're restarting and we're bringing employees in, how are we protecting them? And if we're bringing customers in, how are we arranging things that are in a different flow and a different arrangement than it used to be? Talking to a franchisor that was primarily inline food retail locations, and they never before had curb service because they had no parking authorization exclusive to them in front. They obviously didn't have any drive-through. So they could do delivery, but they couldn't do anything else. Well, they reconfigured in a way that allowed them to do carry out, which was designed around what turned out to be now a more or less empty parking lot, so that they had a negotiation with the landlords in many locations to allow them just to use exclusive areas for their carry out, even though they didn't have a drive-through. So innovations of that sort, it may sound like, well, that's kind of obvious, but it's not easy, and these things require changes. So that sort of thing, what we're seeing is sort of what can we do within the current construction shell that we're dealing with that would allow the change? How do we minimize menu? We've seen some of the big food brands change their menu offering, narrow their menu offering. Part of that is a supply chain issue, but part of it is just an operating efficiency issue in this during this period. So those are incremental changes that we're seeing show up. I think longer term, and what we haven't seen as a result yet, but we have talked to franchisors that are rethinking just what is the footprint configuration that we need going forward. If we're going to add a new unit, if we're going to change some of our units, how do we change them in a way that will minimize not just the risks that they have today, but will actually start to change, address how consumer behavior is evolving as a result of this.
Excellent. And my good friend Bill Edwards just mentioned that there's a lot of innovation going on with brands doing business outside the U.S. as well, and just wanted to bolster that. So, Bill, thank you for that comment.
Well, and I just to that point, I've seen recently Bill has put out a couple updates every couple of weeks for those that are interested. He is providing I think it's region by region update of how things are unfolding and how close to coming back are many countries across the world. This downturn has put over 170 countries into recession in the last 8 weeks. This never happened in the history of the world, to my knowledge, that quickly and that profusely across the entire world. It's over 170 countries that have already been determined to be in recession right now. Well, out of that, as we know in franchising will go where opportunities are, and out of that will come a whole new shifting of market share, of competitiveness that comes out of that. So there's a lot to look at there.
Oh, yeah, most definitely. Next question. Can you describe your research on evaluating patterns of social and consumer behavior? Where does your supporting data come from, and do you have the ability to share that component specifically? Thank you.
Well, the answer is it comes from a lot of different
already, but still, if you can elaborate more, that would be wonderful.
Well, the social mobility, the social and consumer behavior, those are things that we have in recent months spent a lot of time studying and understanding. And I'll give you just one example of that. By the way, the slides that they have sources for the data that we did show in the slides, but more broadly, the social behavior is largely driven. There's a lot of data sources that are starting to come out around social mobility, how activities have taken place that have led to the spread of the virus over time, and being able to track that. And we have tapped into some of those sources. Some of them have been around for a while, but they just haven't been used in this way. The ability to have visibility into movement of cell phones anonymously, but tracking flow of people is what a lot of this is built on. And what we've done is we've taken that information and overlaid it with where franchise unit locations are, and overlaid that with what the confirmed case patterns have been on a week-to-week basis over the last 4 or 5 weeks, to start to be able to help some franchisors understand what's going on differentially within their system.
Excellent. Thank you, Daryl. Next question. Have you done any analysis on which franchise sectors or NAICS codes that will recover fastest, childcare and FFC first, or dining restaurants last? Any insights into which sectors you think will bounce back quicker than others?
We are in the process of looking at that now. I don't have a definitive answer to that. I think some of the more obvious ones, the ones that were hurt more and are in a longer recovery path. But we haven't done a sector by sector analysis that would allow that. We are in the process of doing some of that. We're updating the IFA's economic impact study that was done as a projection that came out in January. And we're going to update that at mid-year, and some of that type of analysis will be in it. So we should have in coming weeks an ability to answer that question in a little more detail, but we haven't done any significant research in that yet.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see here. Let's see. What is your opinion of the printed advertising world? I just had to throw this one out to you. I'm dying to know what your response is going to be. Sorry, Daryl.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious what my response is going to be too. I don't know how to answer that just off the top of my head. I'll say I have a very favorable opinion of all industries. They're going to be brands that get out in front quickly and really capture market share as a result of this. Whenever you have dramatic change, as we have had here, maybe this is the most dramatic we've had in my lifetime, but whenever you have dramatic change, it reshuffles the deck somewhat, and it gives opportunities to a number of brands that see an early advantage in getting in front of consumers in a different way, and to capture market share early on that becomes more sustainable over time. And that's where advertising comes in. That's the essence of advertising, is to be able to do that market positioning. So in terms of the advertising side of it, I think it's fairly powerful. In terms of the print, I'm not sure if the question was directed to print media or print related franchises. I'm not quite sure what the question was, so I can't really respond beyond that.
No, that's perfectly understandable, and thanks. What would the scenario of fallout look like if franchisors couldn't sustain and we, the franchisees, become sole owners of the franchise? Interesting.
There have been some instances historically where some franchisees have taken control of the brand as a result of either financial crises or operational problems that were insurmountable, and a group of franchisees have taken control of it. So there's certainly experience that one can point to as to how that was done. Perhaps the most the one that comes to mind when it was the Roy Rogers brand that was part the QSR that was part of McDonald or part of
Yes.
Marriott, and it was sold Hardee's. It was folded into it. The brand went away, except a group of franchisees in Maryland said, "Wait a minute, we'd like to buy the rights to the brand and continue it," and so they did, and it exists to this day. Well, there are events that have happened where you've seen franchisees do that. I think we're in a period now where just about any form of change you can point to that some system has done. We have franchisees that are major investors in a franchisor. You have former franchisees that have acquired franchise brands, NRD as an example. Aziz Hashim's operation. So you see where there's been activity all the way around the franchise business model. So I think the answer to that is these things can happen and are likely in some cases to happen.
Good. Wonderful, and thank you. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. This one, let's try this one on for size. Can you provide any insight into the situation of the mall food court operator? What do you suggest in terms of landlord negotiations, as we will soon be reopening to heavily reduced traffic? Can you provide any insight into the situation of the mall food court operator? What do you suggest in terms of landlord negotiations, as we will soon be reopening? Any insights would be helpful. Thank you.
Well, I can only give a business perspective to that. I don't want to give a legal perspective. I'm not qualified to do that. I'm not qualified to give other perspectives, but I will give a couple of observations, and that is the commercial real estate industry is really reeling right now. And the issue for a mall operator is getting traffic back into the mall. You can't do that if there are a bunch of closed locations inside the mall. So the willingness on the part of a commercial mall developer is far greater today to have something that will get activity back and have enough businesses in the mall to attract that activity, that from a negotiating standpoint, it would seem to me that if they're not showing a lot of willingness today to negotiate, patience. They will shortly, because they have a lot of pressure. One challenge that exists in the commercial real estate area that we have seen come up in recent years is that oftentimes the financing that the commercial real estate operator got had limitations on how low they could go with rent, how many different kind of variations they could have, because they in turn got funded through institutional money that was then rolled up into other securitized instruments. So they have some constraints on many of them do on what they're able to do. But a lot of that is going to have to change, because it's simply, from a business standpoint, you can't have a mall function without operating businesses in it. And in order for them to get to that point, they've got to have some flexibility in working with the operators who've been shut out of those malls.
Well, excellent. Well, on that note, though we do have a handful of questions left here, what I'd like to do, Daryl, is we'll share these questions with you after today's webinar, and maybe the ones that you're able to address, you could address them after the fact. There were some questions that I just responded to people directly to see if we could get answers, asking them to email me to see if I could get some answers from our government relations team. But Daryl, as always, I can't thank you enough for your insights. I always learn something from you, and I really do appreciate it. But can't thank you enough for your time. And if anybody wants to reach out to Daryl directly, here's his contact information: djohnson@frandata.com. And Daryl, on that note, just can't thank you enough, and also want to thank everybody for participating today. And please remember and keep in mind that IFA is standing with you, and the franchise family, the franchise community is standing with you, and we will all get through this challenging time together, and we will find our way through the roadmap to recovery. So on that note, Daryl, can't thank you enough. Enjoy things down in South Carolina, my friend, and look forward to seeing you in person when we get through this mess. So on that note, can't thank you enough, my friend. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Do appreciate it. Thank you, Paul.
You bet. Take care, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Stay well. Stay safe, everyone. Take care. Bye now.